When I first met Allison, we were both barely scraping by. I was fresh out of college with a degree in engineering and a mountain of student debt, and she was working 2 jobs while trying to finish her degree in nursing. Our dates were simple back then: walks in the park, home-cooked meals, and the occasional splurge on a movie night. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and that felt like enough. Allison had this optimism about her, this belief that no matter how hard things got, we could face it together. She used to say, "As long as we have love, everything else will fall into place." And I believed her. We lived in a tiny apartment that could barely fit a couch and a bed. The walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's TV, and the plumbing creaked like it was ready to give out at any moment. But it was home. We'd stay up late talking about our dreams, owning a house, starting a family, maybe even traveling the world someday. It wasn't easy, though. There were nights when we'd argue about money, how to stretch our budget for groceries, how to handle an unexpected bill. But those fights always ended the same way, with one of us apologizing and the other reassuring, "We'll get through this." And somehow, we always did. Things started to turn around after a few years. I landed a stable job at an engineering firm, and Allison got her nursing license. We moved into a modest house in the suburbs, not fancy, but it was ours. For the first time, we had a little breathing room financially. We weren't rich by any means, but we could afford a few luxuries, a nice dinner out, a vacation every now and then. Looking back, those years were some of the happiest of my life. We were partners in every sense of the word. We built our life together, brick by brick, and every accomplishment felt like a shared victory. If you'd told me then that everything would fall apart, I wouldn't have believed you. Back then, I thought we were unshakable. As the years passed, Allison and I settled into what most would call an average middle-class life. We weren't living extravagantly, but we were comfortable. I continued to climb the ladder at my engineering firm, earning steady raises and promotions. Allison found a job she loved at a local hospital, and while the hours were demanding, she took pride in her work. We started to enjoy some of the things we used to dream about. Our home, though modest, became a source of pride for both of us. Allison filled it with her personal touch, carefully chosen furniture, framed photos of our happiest moments, and an ever-changing assortment of seasonal decorations. Weekends became a sacred time for us. We'd work in the garden together or go on long drives just to get out of the house. Sometimes, we'd treat ourselves to dinner at one of the fancier restaurants downtown, laughing over glasses of wine and sharing bites from each other's plates. But as our lives stabilized, I noticed subtle changes in Allison. She began to spend more time on her appearance. Not just the usual routine, this was different. She started buying expensive makeup brands, booking appointments for her hair and nails, and curating her wardrobe with pieces that felt out of place for our life. I didn't think much of it at first. If anything, I was happy that she was taking time for herself. After years of grinding through school and work, she deserved to feel good. I brushed off the small twinge of unease that crept in whenever she came home with a new outfit or mentioned a brand I'd never heard of. Around this time, Allison also became more active on social media. She'd never been one to post much, but suddenly, our quiet life became a stream of carefully posed photos, pictures of her morning coffee, shots of her in her new clothes, and captions filled with motivational quotes. She started getting more attention online, too. Comments and likes from strangers, some harmless, others more flirtatious than I was comfortable with. When I mentioned it, she brushed it off with a laugh. "It's just for fun," she'd say, waving her hand dismissively. "Don't read too much into it." I wanted to trust her. I did trust her. We'd built a life together on that foundation of trust, and I had no reason to doubt her. But still, there was something about the way she seemed different. I told myself it was just part of growing older, of finding new ways to express herself. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It started small. One day, Allison came home with a pair of designer sunglasses, sleek, modern, and clearly expensive. I raised an eyebrow when I saw her wearing them. "Nice sunglasses," I said casually. "When did you get those?" "Oh, these," she said, almost too quickly. "A patient's family member gave them to me as a thank you. I guess they own a boutique or something." It felt odd, but I didn't push. Nurses often form strong connections with patients and their families, and it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that someone would gift her something nice. Still, it nagged at me. A few weeks later, another gift appeared, a leather handbag that looked far too upscale for our usual budget. When I commented on it, Allison shrugged it off with the same breezy explanation. "Just a gift," she said with a smile. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. These gifts, while infrequent, were beginning to feel like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. They didn't match our lifestyle or the people I thought she interacted with daily. Then came the jewelry. One evening, Allison came home wearing a delicate gold bracelet with a small diamond charm. I noticed it immediately as we sat down for dinner. "That's beautiful," I said, gesturing to the bracelet. "Where did you get it?" She glanced at it briefly, as if she'd forgotten she was wearing it. "Oh, this? A colleague gave it to me. They were cleaning out their jewelry and thought I'd like it." Her tone was casual, but something about her explanation felt rehearsed, like she'd anticipated the question. A few days later, I saw her wearing a pair of emerald earrings that were even more striking, and expensive looking. When I asked about them, she told me they were a gift from one of her girlfriends. By now, I was starting to feel uneasy. Allison had never been the type to receive so many gifts, let alone ones of such value. And the fact that these items kept appearing without any real explanation made it hard to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. It wasn't just the gifts that bothered me, it was the way Allison seemed different. She was more secretive, spending more time on her phone or retreating to another room to take calls. When I asked her about it, she dismissed my concerns with a laugh. "Don't be silly," she said. "It's just work stuff, or catching up with friends." I wanted to believe her. But as the expensive items continued to appear, rings, necklaces, even a designer watch, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. Our conversation started to feel more strained. When I tried to bring up the gifts or her changing behavior, she'd wave it off, telling me I was overthinking things. "You've been working so hard," she said one evening, leaning in to kiss me on the cheek. "You need to relax." Her affection felt hollow, like a distraction to keep me from asking more questions. And for a while, it worked. But the nagging doubts in my mind refused to go away. The gifts had been piling up, small at first, then increasingly extravagant. Allison's explanations became vaguer each time, and while I tried to push down my suspicions, they were growing harder to ignore. One evening, she came home wearing a new bracelet. Unlike the delicate gold one she'd worn before, this was bold and unmistakably expensive, a platinum band inlaid with tiny diamonds that sparkled in the light. "Wow," I said, my voice laced with unease. "That's something. Where did you get it?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second before smiling. "Oh, it's just from one of the doctors at work. A little thank you for helping him organize a charity event." I stared at her, trying to gauge if she was being honest. "That seems generous," I said carefully. "Are gifts like that common at your hospital?" "Not really," she admitted, brushing it off with a laugh. "But Dr. Kane is just one of those people who likes to spoil everyone." Her answer didn't sit right with me. Who gives a platinum and diamond bracelet as a thank you? It was the kind of gift you'd give a spouse or lover, not a colleague. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the bracelet. Allison had always been a practical person, never one to flaunt wealth or luxury. But lately, she seemed to relish the attention her new possessions brought. She'd post pictures of her jewelry and handbags on social media, captioning them with vague comments like, feeling blessed, or, grateful for life's little surprises. The comments poured in, compliments from friends, inquiries about where she'd gotten the items. Her replies were always coy, deflecting the questions with playful emojis or vague answers. I couldn't help but feel like there was a side of her I didn't know, one that had been slowly emerging over the past few months. A few days later, I came home early from work. Allison's car was in the driveway, and I expected to find her curled up on the couch or in the kitchen. Instead, I heard her voice from upstairs, muffled but urgent. I crept up the stairs, careful not to make any noise. The door to our bedroom was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could hear her talking on the phone. "No, I told you I can't tonight," she was saying, her tone hushed but firm. "It's too risky." There was a pause, followed by a softer voice I couldn't make out. "I know," she said, sighing. "I'll figure something out. Just, don't call me here, okay?" My heart sank. I wanted to barge in, to demand answers, but I froze. A part of me wasn't ready to confront the possibility of what I already suspected. That night, as Allison slept, I lay awake, replaying the conversation in my mind. Who was she talking to? What was too risky? And why did she sound so guilty? The next day, while she was at work, I decided to do something I'd never done before, snoop. I started with her jewelry box, which was overflowing with the gifts she'd accumulated. Each piece felt like a question mark, a clue to something I didn't yet understand. But it wasn't until I checked her phone that I found something concrete. She'd been careful to delete her call history, but her text messages told a different story. There were exchanges with a number saved as K, short, cryptic messages that sent my stomach into free fall. K, did you get the package? Allison, yes. It's beautiful. K, anything for you. Can't wait to see you again. Allison, soon, I promise. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The texts left no doubt, Allison was hiding something. And I needed to find out what. After finding the texts, I couldn't stop obsessing over the identity of K. My gut told me this wasn't just a colleague or a casual friend, it was something more. The way Allison responded to his messages, the tone of their exchanges, it all felt intimate. The following evening, Allison mentioned she had to work late. Normally, I wouldn't have thought much of it, but after everything I'd uncovered, her words felt like a lie. That's fine, I said casually. I'll probably head to bed early anyway. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and hurried out the door, her heels clicking against the pavement. As soon as she was gone, I grabbed my jacket and car keys. If she was lying about work, I intended to find out where she was really going. I kept a safe distance as I followed her car through the streets. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. She eventually turned onto a quiet downtown street lined with upscale restaurants and boutique hotels. She parked her car and walked into a high-end bar that was softly lit with glowing chandeliers and a crowd of people dressed far better than I was. From my vantage point in the car, I watched her greet a man waiting at the entrance. Even from a distance, I could tell he was sharply dressed, expensive suit, polished shoes, the kind of look that screamed wealth. He leaned in and kissed her cheek, his hand lingering on her waist in a way that made my stomach churn. I knew instantly, this was K. I parked nearby and walked to the bar's entrance, careful not to be seen. Through the window, I spotted them sitting at a private corner table, their heads close together as they talked. She laughed at something he said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The way she looked at him was what broke me. It wasn't just friendly or professional, it was the same look she used to give me when we first fell in love. I wanted to storm in and confront them, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a picture through the window, capturing the two of them together. Proof of what I already knew. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, trying to decide what to do next. When I finally saw them leave, I stayed at a distance, following as they walked to a nearby hotel. My chest tightened as they entered the lobby together, her hand brushing against his. I waited until they disappeared into the elevator before walking into the lobby myself. The desk clerk barely glanced at me as I slipped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor, where they'd gone. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped out into a quiet hallway. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I followed the muffled sound of laughter to a room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open, just enough for me to see inside. And there she was, on her knees in front of him, his belt undone, her hands gripping his thighs as she. I turned away before I could see more, bile rising in my throat. My mind went blank, a storm of rage and heartbreak blinding me. I stumbled back down the hallway, not caring if they heard me. When I reached my car, I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel as tears streamed down my face. All the trust, the love, the years we built together, it felt like it had been smashed to pieces in an instant. The image of her with him was seared into my mind, a wound that I knew would never fully heal. For the first time, I realized that the woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built a life with, was gone. Or maybe she'd never been real in the first place. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. I spent the night in my car, parked at an empty lot on the outskirts of town. Sleep was out of the question, my mind wouldn't stop replaying what I'd seen. I felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out everything inside me and left a shell behind. By morning, my anger had burned away, leaving a cold, heavy sadness in its place. I knew I couldn't avoid the confrontation forever. This wasn't just about what Allison had done, it was about reclaiming my dignity. When I walked through the door of our home later that morning, she was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee. She looked up and smiled, the same easy smile I'd seen 1,000 times before. "You're up early," she said. I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table in front of her. The photo of her and Kay at the bar was displayed on the screen. Her smile faltered. "What's this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You tell me," I said, my tone colder than I'd ever heard it. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her face draining of color. "James, I can explain." "Don't," I snapped, cutting her off. "Don't you dare lie to me again. I followed you, Allison. I saw you with him. I know everything." Her hands shook as she tried to reach for mine, but I pulled away. "Please, James," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think," I said, laughing bitterly. "You were with him, Allison. You went to a hotel with him. What part of that am I supposed to misunderstand?" Tears streamed down her face as she crumbled before me. "It didn't mean anything," she said, sobbing. "I swear, it didn't mean anything. He was just someone who made me feel special." "Special?" I said, my voice rising. "You think sneaking around behind my back with a man who buys you jewelry and takes you to expensive bars makes you special? It makes you a liar, Allison. It makes you a cheat." "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice pleading. "It just got out of control. He gave me gifts, and you sold yourself for them," I said harshly, my words like venom. "You sold everything we built together for some diamonds and handbags." Her sobs grew louder, but I felt no sympathy. The image of her with him was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. "I want you out," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "James, please," she begged. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I'll end it with him. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "It's already over, Allison," I said. "You ended it the moment you chose him over us. Pack your things and leave." Her face crumpled, and she reached for me again, but I stepped back. "You don't get to cry," I said, my voice cold. "You don't get to act like the victim. Not this time. I turned and walked out the door, her sobs echoing behind me. Leaving the house felt like walking away from everything I'd ever known. Our home, our memories, our life together, it all felt tainted now, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I didn't know what came next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in a life built on lies. After leaving the house, I checked into a small motel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, a cramped room with thin walls and a bed that creaked every time I moved, but it gave me space to think. That first night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him. The betrayal felt like a physical wound, deep and throbbing, refusing to let me rest. I kept asking myself how it had come to this. Had I missed the signs? Was there something I could have done differently? But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became, this wasn't about me. It wasn't about anything I'd done or failed to do. Allison had made her choices, and they were choices that destroyed everything we had built together. The next morning, my phone buzzed with messages from her. Allison, James, please come home so we can talk. Allison, I'm sorry. I'll do anything to fix this. Please just give me a chance. Allison, I made a mistake, but I love you. Don't throw us away. I stared at the messages, a hollow ache in my chest. A part of me wanted to respond, to confront her again, to tell her exactly how much she'd hurt me. But what was the point? She'd already shown me who she was, and I couldn't unsee it. Instead, I blocked her number. The next week was a blur of paperwork and legal appointments. Filing for divorce felt like closing a chapter of my life that I'd never expected to end this way. Each signature, each meeting with my lawyer, felt like ripping off a bandage that hadn't even begun to heal. When the papers were finally served, I heard from mutual friends that Allison had been devastated. She hadn't expected me to go through with it so quickly. She thought I'd cool off, that I'd forgive her like she'd begged me to. But there was no going back. Not after what I'd seen. The day I returned to the house to collect my things, it felt like stepping into a ghost of my old life. The furniture, the photos on the walls, even the faint scent of Allison's perfume, it all felt like a mockery of the life we used to share. She wasn't there when I arrived. I'd made sure of that, asking my lawyer to coordinate a time when she'd be out. Still, the silence in the house was deafening. As I packed my belongings, I stumbled across little reminders of our past, the ticket stubs from our first vacation together, the handwritten notes we used to leave each other, the framed photo of us on our wedding day. I almost threw it away, but something stopped me. Instead, I placed it face down in the box and sealed it shut. That night, back in the motel, the weight of it all hit me. The anger, the sadness, the betrayal, it all came crashing down at once. I sat on the edge of the bed and cried, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that leave you feeling raw and empty. I wasn't just mourning the loss of my marriage. I was mourning the person I thought Allison was, the life we'd planned together, the future that would never come to be. But beneath the grief, there was also a spark of something else. Determination. She had taken so much from me, my trust, my love, my sense of security. But she wouldn't take my future. The days following the divorce were some of the hardest of my life. Even though I had made the decision to leave, the reality of starting over was overwhelming. I stayed in the motel for a few weeks, living out of boxes and eating takeout. Each morning felt like a battle to get out of bed, to face a world that seemed colder and emptier without the life I'd known. Work became my escape. I buried myself in projects, taking on overtime whenever I could. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but no one said anything, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't have the energy to explain what had happened. One afternoon, I came back to the motel to find a note slipped under the door. It was from Allison. James, please. I need to talk to you. I've made so many mistakes, but I love you, and I want to make things right. I'll be at the park tomorrow at 3 p.m. if you're willing to hear me out. I stared at the note, my emotions churning. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to block her out completely and never look back. But another part, curious, angry, maybe even hopeful, decided I needed to hear what she had to say. The next day, I found myself standing by the fountain in the park. It was a bright, sunny afternoon, but the warmth of the sun did nothing to ease the knot in my chest. Allison arrived a few minutes later, her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of her choices had finally started to crush her. "James," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I crossed my arms, my posture stiff. "You wanted to talk. So talk." She took a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. "I know I don't deserve it, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I ruined everything, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." I said nothing, letting her words hang in the air. "I ended things with him," she continued. "It wasn't real, James. It was just, stupid. I let myself get caught up in the attention, the gifts, the fantasy of it all. But none of it mattered. None of it was worth losing you." Her voice cracked, and she reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back. "You're right," I said coldly. "It wasn't worth it. And now you have to live with that." Her face crumpled, and she dropped her hand. "Please, James," she whispered. "I know I hurt you, but I love you. I'll do whatever it takes to make it up to you. Just, please don't walk away from us." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the love I used to. All I saw was someone who had broken me, who had taken the life we built and thrown it away for something cheap and meaningless. "You already walked away," I said, my voice steady but firm. "The moment you chose him, you ended us. And I'm not going to spend the rest of my life trying to rebuild something you destroyed." Tears streamed down her face as she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. "James, please." "No," I said, turning away. "This is goodbye, Allison. I hope you figure out who you are someday. But it's not going to be with me." As I walked away, her sobs followed me, but I didn't look back. For the first time, I felt a sense of finality, of closure. The chapter with Allison was over, and while the pain of her betrayal still lingered, I knew I was finally free to start writing a new story. After our final meeting in the park, I shut the door on Allison completely. I blocked her number, unfollowed her on social media, and avoided places I thought she might frequent. It wasn't easy, part of me still wanted to know how she was handling everything, whether she was as broken as I'd been. But I knew looking back would only reopen wounds I was trying to heal. Months passed, and I started to hear bits and pieces about her through mutual friends. At first, it seemed like she was doing fine. She'd kept the house and was still posting pictures of her carefully curated life online. I saw photos of her smiling at brunches, attending parties, and flaunting the remnants of the jewelry she'd kept. But beneath the surface, her perfect image was beginning to crack. The whispers started small, friends mentioning that Allison seemed different, more withdrawn. Someone told me she'd been spending more than she could afford, trying to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to during her time with Kay. And then came the news I'd secretly expected: the rich guy, the one who'd showered her with gifts and stolen her away, had moved on. He'd gotten bored, tossed her aside like a toy he no longer wanted. She thought she'd landed in some fairy tale, one friend said. But now she's stuck with nothing to show for it. I won't lie, hearing that gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. She'd traded our life for shiny trinkets and empty promises, and now she was paying the price. Without him to support her, Allison's financial situation started to unravel. The house we'd shared was too much for her to handle on her own, and soon it was on the market. I heard she'd moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, far from the upscale neighborhood we'd once called home. Social media, once her playground, became a graveyard of infrequent posts. The glamorous photos disappeared, replaced by vague updates and motivational quotes that felt more like pleas for validation than genuine positivity. I heard she tried to date again, but it never went anywhere. Most people saw through the facade, realizing she was chasing the fantasy of wealth and attention that had ultimately left her empty. It was a slow decline, and by the time the first year after our divorce rolled around, the Allison I had known was unrecognizable. One day, I got an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from her. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter was handwritten, the tone apologetic and wistful. James. I know I don't deserve your time or forgiveness, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. Losing you was the biggest mistake of my life, and I think about it every day. I hope you're doing well, and I hope you found happiness. I just wanted you to know that I'll always regret what I did and what we lost. Reading it, I felt a twinge of sadness, not for her, but for the life we'd shared and the way it had ended. But the wounds she'd inflicted were too deep, the trust too thoroughly shattered. I didn't respond. That letter confirmed what I'd already known: Allison's life had crumbled, and she was reaching out for something she'd never have again. I didn't hate her anymore, but I didn't pity her either. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. After Allison's letter, I found myself reflecting on the past year, not just what had happened with her, but how it had changed me. The divorce had left me in pieces, and the months that followed were some of the hardest of my life. But slowly, bit by bit, I'd started to rebuild. At first, it was the small victories that kept me going. Showing up for work every day, even when I didn't feel like it. Finding a new apartment and turning it into a space that felt like my own. Reconnecting with friends I'd drifted away from during my marriage. Then came the bigger changes. I started therapy, which helped me process the anger and grief I'd been carrying. I joined a gym, channeling my frustration into something productive. I even took up new hobbies, things I'd always wanted to try but had put off because life with Allison had always seemed too busy. One of the most unexpected changes came in my career. Throwing myself into work had been a coping mechanism at first, but it turned into something more. I started taking on high-profile projects and pushing myself in ways I hadn't before. A year after the divorce, I was promoted to a management position, something I'd dreamed about for years. The recognition felt like a validation of all the effort I'd put in, not just at work, but in rebuilding my life. With time, the pain of Allison's betrayal began to fade. It didn't disappear completely. There were still moments when the memories would resurface, sharp and painful. But those moments became less frequent, and I started to see them as reminders of how far I'd come. I realized that her betrayal wasn't just about her, it was about me, too. I had ignored the warning signs, made excuses for her behavior, and held on to a version of her that no longer existed. Moving on meant not just letting go of her but letting go of the person I'd been in that relationship. About a year and a half after the divorce, I went to a friend's barbecue. It was the kind of casual gathering I hadn't attended in years, filled with laughter, music, and the smell of grilled food. That's where I met Emily. She was smart, funny, and had a warmth about her that drew people in. We spent most of the evening talking, sharing stories about our lives, and by the end of the night, I found myself smiling in a way I hadn't in a long time. We started dating a few weeks later. It was slow, cautious, and completely different from what I'd experienced with Allison. With Emily, there were no games, no hidden agendas, just honesty and genuine connection. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a future worth looking forward to. While my life was slowly piecing itself back together, Allison's was falling apart. I didn't go looking for updates about her, but the occasional tidbit would find its way to me through mutual friends or social media. At first, she tried to maintain the image of someone who was thriving. New selfies, vague inspirational captions, and attempts to show she was moving on. But those posts became less frequent, eventually replaced by silence. I heard she'd struggled to find a stable relationship. After Kay discarded her, she jumped between short-lived flings, none of which seemed to stick. Friends mentioned that she'd started drinking more, her once confident demeanor replaced by a fragile insecurity. The lavish gifts she'd collected during her affair were sold off piece by piece as her financial situation worsened. The house we'd shared was gone, replaced by a cramped apartment in a part of town she used to turn her nose up at. One evening, while grabbing groceries after work, I ran into her. She was at the self-checkout, fumbling with a card that kept getting declined. When she noticed me, her face froze. "James," she said softly, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I didn't respond right away, unsure of how to react. She looked thinner, almost gaunt, and her clothes, once so meticulously curated, seemed hastily thrown together. "How have you been?" she asked awkwardly. "I'm fine," I said, my tone neutral. "You?" She hesitated, glancing at the card reader before giving a forced smile. "Oh, just taking things one day at a time." There was an awkward pause before I said, "Take care of yourself, Allison." As I walked away, I felt a strange mix of emotions, pity, relief, and a deep sense of validation. She had chosen her path, and now she was living with the consequences. That night, I thought about how much had changed since the divorce. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I first left. The heartbreak, the anger, the betrayal, they had reshaped me, but not in the way I'd feared. I was stronger now, more self-assured. The things I once thought I couldn't survive had only made me more resilient. I had rebuilt my life brick by brick, and while the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined me. Allison, on the other hand, had clung to the illusion of the life she'd destroyed. She'd chased fleeting pleasures and superficial rewards, only to find herself alone and adrift. It wasn't just sad, it was tragic. As for Emily, our relationship was blossoming. She brought a warmth and stability into my life that I hadn't realized I was missing. We didn't rush things, but every moment with her felt genuine, like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating in doubt and deceit. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, she rested her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm glad we found each other." "So am I," I replied, realizing that for the first time in years, I felt truly happy. As the year rolled on, the contrast between Allison's life and mine became even more pronounced. While I didn't seek out updates on her, mutual friends occasionally filled me in on how she was doing. The news was always the same: she was struggling. She'd lost her job, though the details were murky. Some said it was due to her declining performance, others hinted at office drama that she hadn't handled well. Either way, it was clear she was adrift. Her social circle had shrunk as well. The friends she'd once flaunted online were nowhere to be seen, and the few remaining seemed more like acquaintances than true companions. She was a shadow of the person she used to be, and as much as I tried to detach from the past, a part of me couldn't help but feel pity for her. One evening, as I sat on my apartment's balcony with a cup of coffee, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the divorce, it had all felt like the end of the world at the time. But now, looking back, I realized it had been a turning point. Allison's choices had forced me to confront things I might never have faced otherwise. I'd learned to stand on my own, to rebuild not just my life but my sense of self-worth. I thought about the man I'd been during our marriage, too trusting, too willing to overlook red flags for the sake of keeping the peace. That version of me was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more discerning. And as much as I hated what Allison had done, I couldn't deny that it had led me to where I was now. By this point, my relationship with Emily had grown into something I hadn't thought possible. She was patient and kind, giving me the space I needed to heal while also encouraging me to embrace the future. One day, as we walked through the park, she turned to me with a curious look. "Do you ever think about the future?" "All the time," I said with a smile. "And what do you see?" she asked, her tone light but hopeful. I paused, considering her question. I see a life where trust and honesty are at the center, I said. A life where I don't have to second-guess everything, where I can just be happy. She smiled, squeezing my hand. That sounds like a pretty good future. A few weeks later, I received an email from Allison. The subject line was simple, "Thank you." I debated whether to open it but eventually decided to read it. James. I don't expect a response, but I wanted to say thank you. For everything. For the life we shared, even though I ruined it, and for the way you walked away with dignity when I didn't deserve it. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I'm trying to learn from them. I hope you found happiness, you deserve it. I closed the email without replying. There was nothing left to say. But as I sat there, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness and resentment had finally faded, leaving only a quiet sense of closure. Looking back on everything that happened, I've come to realize that the pain I went through wasn't just an end, it was a beginning. Allison's betrayal shattered my life in ways I never could have imagined, but it also forced me to grow in ways I never thought possible. I learned that trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, rebuilding it requires more than apologies and promises, it requires actions and unwavering commitment. Allison couldn't give me that, and ultimately, it was her inability to honor our life together that led to the end. But perhaps the most important lesson I learned was about self-worth. For years, I had allowed myself to ignore red flags, to brush aside doubts, because I was afraid of losing what we'd built. It wasn't until everything fell apart that I realized I deserved more honesty, more respect, more love. Watching Allison's life unravel was a reminder that the choices we make define us. She traded our life together for fleeting pleasures and superficial rewards, only to find herself empty and alone. It was tragic, but it was her path to walk, and I no longer carried the weight of her mistakes. For me, the journey was different. The betrayal broke me, but it also gave me the opportunity to rebuild from the ground up. I discovered strength I didn't know I had, reconnected with the things that made me happy, and found love again with someone who valued me for who I was. If there's one thing I hope others can take from my experience, it's this: never settle for less than you deserve. Trust your instincts, value yourself, and know when it's time to let go. Love should be built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect, not lies and selfishness. And while heartbreak is painful, it can also be a catalyst for growth, a chance to redefine your life and discover what truly matters. For me, letting go of Allison was the hardest thing I've ever done. But in the end, it was also the best decision I ever made.